Kublai Khan sat upon a throne whose shadow fell from the frozen steppes of China all the way to the burning shores of Persia. A silk map of the conquered world spread before him. He was not a man who merely dreamed of victory. He was a man who regarded defeat as a form of heresy, and every unconquered land as an open wound demanding iron and blood. And there existed, at the furthest edge of the eastern sea, a small crescent of islands that defied him in absolute silence, returning his envoys headless, burning his ultimatums without reply. Japan, this rocky archipelago suspended in the gray waters of the east, was, in the eyes of the Mongol world, a direct challenge to fate itself, and Kublai swore by his conquering ancestors to break it. He wrote to the lords of Japan in the language of masters addressing servants. Those who withheld tribute today would render their blood tomorrow, for the Mongol Empire recognized no law called refusal. But the samurai were not the Arabs caught unprepared, nor the Chinese who bent beneath prolonged siege. They were a people forged in the doctrine of beautiful death, who did not flinch before the abyss. The shogun across the Iron Sea read the great Khan's letters with eyes as cold and unyielding as flint, then committed them to flame and sent one single command to his coastal warlords: prepare. Those Mongol envoys who set foot upon Japanese soil were returned in caskets, and some were not returned at all, and this was Kamakura's eloquent answer to all the Khan's magnificent rhetoric. The Mongol apparatus at its zenith was a thing of terrifying architecture. More than a million souls under arms across a dominion without parallel, and 75 years of unbroken conquest sharpening its doctrine. The Japanese, by contrast, had not faced a major war in a century, yet their spiritual armament dwarfed their iron, and a land perpetually shaken by earthquakes and storms had forged in its sons a hardness no outsider could comprehend. In the war halls of Kublai, maps were unrolled before commanders, and fingers traced the western gateway of Japan, Hakata Bay, open as an unguarded door at the edge of a sleeping household. The Mongols believed the sea was merely a temporary inconvenience between invasion and submission, that the winds themselves were servants of the Khan's will whenever he demanded passage. But the sea was deliberating its own counsel, and the heavens were preparing a response that neither the Khan nor his generals nor his temple astronomers could read in any star. On Japan's western shores, the samurai stood in the gray coastal wind. Beneath their iron helmets ran cold blood and the spirit that recognized no path toward negotiation, their swords catching moonlight like threatening mirrors in the dark. Kublai understood that the conquest of Japan would not merely add territory to his dominion, it would permanently inscribe Mongol terror across all of Eastern civilization, making every Asian kingdom breathe an air heavy with his name. That night, the wind howled above Hakata Bay in a low, continuous whistle, as though rehearsing a name still sealed in some celestial tablet. Kamikaze, the divine wind, not yet born into history. The entire tableau was a theater of magnificent contradictions. A Khan who refused to accept the concept of impossibility, and an island that refused to accept the concept of surrender, with an ocean between them counting soldiers and preparing to feast. In the autumn of 1274, a Mongol-Korean armada of 900 vessels carrying 33,000 warriors set sail, descended from an imperial machine that governed half the known world. The fleet cut through the fog of the Japan Sea as blades cut silk, carrying aboard not merely soldiers, but a doctrine of annihilation refined through decades of systematic slaughter across 3 continents. The moment those ships anchored in Hakata Bay, the samurai experienced something unprecedented in their entire martial history, an enemy that refused to fight as individuals and instead moved as a single disciplined organism. Samurai warrior culture demanded honorable single combat. The warrior stepped forward, announced his name and bloodline, and invited his adversary to duel as befitting lords, and found instead 100 arrows tearing him apart. Mongol arrows fell in black cascades from every direction simultaneously, and iron-cased explosive projectiles called tetsuhal detonated among samurai formations like thunder descending into a clear and cloudless sky. The samurai fell back inland in stunned disbelief, their physical wounds far easier to bear than the shattering blow to centuries of pride, facing an enemy that waged war like a machine, not a man. That night, as the Japanese armies retreated inward to reorganize along new lines of defense, the heavens began composing their own answer, not in iron or blood, but in wind. A ferocious storm descended upon the bay in darkness, as though the sea itself had been seized by rage at the foreign footprint upon its threshold, drowning 200 Mongol vessels and driving the exhausted fleet back toward Korean shores. A small Japanese legend was born in the storm's aftermath, whispered by women in temple halls and exchanged by samurai around fires, that the gods had dispatched the tempest as a shield for the sacred island. Yet the dispassionate historian recognizes that what preserved Japan in 1274 was not purely miraculous. It was a compound of ferocious resistance that delayed the Mongol decision long enough for typhoon season to play its natural hand. The Mongols lost between 13 and 20,000 men, drowned and slain, a figure utterly foreign to armies accustomed to opening kingdoms with barely a hemorrhage worth recording in their chronicles. Back in Khan's vast hall, Kublai received the defeat reports with a face that wore no expression. A human face was designed to wear, then spoke 2 words across the silence: a second invasion, greater. It was the vow of a man whose only boundary was annihilation itself, and that vow carried within its folds something he could not know, that nature was already assembling a weapon beyond any military genius's calculation. The Japanese did not surrender their night to long celebration. They understood with the cold clarity of survivors one immovable truth: the Mongols were returning, and the return would be larger, darker, and far more merciless than anything they had witnessed. From the wreckage of the first invasion, the Japanese built something only a people who learned through agony can construct: a complete strategic education, written in the blood of their warriors across the sands of Hakata Bay. They understood that the ancient doctrine of individual glory had become obsolete against a collective machine of disciplined annihilation, and that an open beach was an open invitation to any commander who possessed a fleet. While the samurai tore apart their martial memory and discarded what no longer served, Kublai Khan in Beijing was forging a second campaign that would compel history itself to recalculate its mathematics from the beginning. 7 years separated the 2 invasions, 7 years that constitute the most concentrated military transformation in all of Japan's ancient and formidable history of warfare. The shogun issued his directives before the ink on the casualty reports had dried: construct a stone seawall stretching the full length of Hakata Bay's shoreline, 25 kilometers of defiant, unyielding rock. The very concept of the wall was itself a revolution in Japanese military thought. For the first time, warriors formally acknowledged that the enemy might arrive, and that preparing for that arrival was not cowardice, but tactical wisdom of the highest order. The stone fortification rose to over 1.5 meters in its higher sections, its thickness calculated specifically to arrest a Mongol cavalry charge from bursting directly through the beach in the overwhelming mass assault they had rehearsed. The samurai themselves submitted to a discipline entirely alien to their tradition: coordinated group combat, synchronized maneuver between archer units, cavalry, and infantry, leaving individual glory as the province of peacetime ceremony. They rehearsed how to strike incoming vessels before those vessels had discharged their cargo of warriors upon the shore, and how to launch night raids on anchored fleets with swift boats to ignite sails, unsettle watch rotations, and dispatch sleeping guards. The shogun established an early warning network along the entire western coastline, signal fires leaping from summit to summit like urgent messages carried through a civilization that lived in perpetual, vigilant expectation. In those 7 years, the monks and priests of Japan's temples maintained unceasing prayers, petitioning the gods for what they had been granted in the first invasion: a wind, a tempest, a divine intervention to turn back the human flood from the sacred shores. They held in their theology an iron conviction that Japan was not merely territory but divine inheritance, protected by forces that no Khan, however magnificent his dominion, could challenge without meeting the fate already written for him. In the shipyards of Korea and southern China, the hammers never fell silent. Kublai had commanded the construction of 4,400 vessels and the conscription of 140,000 warriors from across his empire's vast human reserves. The Second Armada taking shape in the empire's harbors represented a number that had never been recorded in the annals of human warfare, and would not be exceeded until the Allied landings at Normandy, 7 centuries in the unborn future. Kublai understood that this campaign was not merely another conquest. It was a message written in blood to every king in Asia who still withheld tribute. No wall, no coastline, no destiny could stop the Mongol tide. Japan knew what was being forged against her, and she prepared what she was able to prepare, while the ocean between them carried in its depths secrets it shared with no cartographer and no general. These 7 years were the stage of the deepest transformation in Japanese martial history, from the aristocratic choreography of single combat to the brutal, coordinated doctrine of collective defense under unified command. What the Japanese did not know was that the greatest weapon would be neither sword, nor wall, nor strategy. It would be time itself, the blood-purchased days of delay that would feed the Mongol tide into the embrace of the hurricane. The samurai stood upon their stone shores and waited for what they knew was coming. In their eyes burned a quiet, absolute fire, declaring that whoever desired this land would pay its price from the deepest vein in his body. In the summer of 1281, Japan's western horizon transformed as though night itself had decided to reconstitute as ships, Mongol and Korean sails blotting the skyline from north to south without interruption or end. 4,400 vessels. That number drops into the memory like a stone into dark water, carrying 140,000 warriors, a figure humanity would not surpass until the shores of Normandy in 1944. The Armada split into 2 terrible columns. The Korean Northern Fleet arrived first, bearing 40,000 warriors, while the colossal Southern Chinese Fleet followed, bearing the remaining 100,000 behind it. The Korean vanguard met Hakata Bay's stone seawall and found nothing remotely resembling what they had expected. No open beach, no lone samurai stepping forward to announce his noble bloodline before dying. They found instead disciplined formations massed behind stone fortifications, ambushes laid in coastal inlets waiting for the leading vessels, and swift raiding boats already moving to fire upon the Armada before it could disgorge its warriors. The samurai night raids upon the Mongol fleet stand among the most audacious military operations of that entire era. Warriors swimming through darkness to hull-climb anchored ships, igniting fires, then vanishing like shadows between worlds. The Mongols bled more in those early weeks than their commanders had projected, yet their numerical advantage remained so overwhelming that no wall and no tactic could dissolve it across any sustained duration. Japan's defensive pockets were eroding day by grinding day, the wall itself fracturing at certain points, and the samurai who had struck the fleet in darkness were growing fewer with each brutal dawn that followed. From Beijing, Kublai Khan dispatched urgent dispatches to his commanders. There was no room for hesitation. Japan falls this summer, or the stain of failure would brand the Khanate's forehead for generations beyond counting. The Mongol High Command understood implicitly that time was the enemy's ally. To suggest delay in the presence of a man who had excised the word postpone from his entire vocabulary was a form of military suicide. Yet what none of the Mongol commanders knew, what none of Kublai's astrologers had mapped across their celestial charts, was that typhoon season in the China Sea reaches its savage peak in July and August. The Korean ships, built in desperate haste for the purpose of coastal trim support in calm, sheltered waters, had not been engineered to withstand what the atmosphere was quietly assembling beyond the western horizon. Japan was absorbing the invasion through the iron of 10,000 samurai and the stone of her coastal wall and the blood of her defenders. And with every day Japan delayed her fall, typhoon season advanced one deliberate step closer. Japanese ferocity was never merely courage for courage's sake. It was, unconsciously, a doctrine of vital delay more decisive in its consequences than any strategy ever drawn on a commander's planning table. Heaven was calculating, the sea was conspiring, the samurai were resisting, Kublai was urging his generals forward, and the hurricane was coiling itself in invisible spirals above the deep waters of the Pacific, patient and absolute. The southern Chinese fleet with its 100,000 warriors had not yet fully converged, both colossal forces struggling toward a single unified strike point that would constitute a pressure beyond Japan's capacity to answer. On the 15th of August, 1281, as the 2 wings of the greatest armada in human history maneuvered toward final coordinated assault, something emerged from the western horizon that appeared in no military manual ever written. The sky began to darken by slow degrees, as though night had determined to arrive in broad and merciless daylight, and the winds began their transformation from a mild coastal breath into a low, growling warning rising from beneath the waves. Then the typhoon came, without announcement, without herald, without the courtesy of warning, arriving as accelerated destiny, winds that unmasted ships and waves that swallowed lesser vessels whole like chaff. The wind that the Japanese named Kamikaze, the divine wind, escalated into a full typhoon that hammered the Mongol armada without pause for 2 consecutive days, granting no commander a single moment of coherent thought or ordered response. The Korean vessels, designed for sheltered coastal waters rather than the open ocean's wrath, snapped before the towering waves like dry reeds, some driven into each other with a violence that reduced both to planks and screaming men. Those Mongol soldiers who managed to reach the Japanese shoreline seeking salvation from the ocean's fury found the samurai waiting there, not with mercy, but with blades that did not trouble themselves with negotiation or quarter. Historians estimate that between 70 and 100,000 Mongol warriors perished in the typhoons of 1281, a casualty figure the Khan's armies had never tasted in any land campaign across their decades of unbroken conquest. The fleet was not obliterated entirely. Some vessels survived and limped back to their harbors, carrying shame and mutilated men. Bearing to Kublai a report, his mind was architecturally unequipped to process without fury. On the Japanese shore, the surviving samurai gazed upon the churning, darkened sea and understood they had witnessed something that exceeded the ordinary mathematics of warfare, and the priests beside them named it simply the hand of heaven intervening. The Mongol defeat at Japan cannot be measured in bodies alone. It must be measured in the fracture it created in the image of the invincible Khan, that image which cracked for the first time before an island that refused to follow the written script. The question that the dispassionate military analyst poses, the one that faith alone cannot answer, is this: had the 2 Mongol fleets not been delayed weeks by Japan's ferocious resistance, would they have struck before typhoon season arrived? The probable answer is yes. The Armada could have achieved its unified assault in June, typhoon season still distant and dormant, and Japan might have fallen to a very different and very final wound. It was Japan's savage, grinding, blood-drenched resistance, never calculated as a typhoon delay mechanism, that constituted the real bullet which slowed the Mongol destiny until the sea could forge its own far larger verdict. The kamikaze was not a miracle that transcended causation. It was the massive consequence of a collision of interlocking causes, the warriors' unyielding endurance, the Mongols' catastrophic miscalculation of timing, the fatal fragility of hastily built ships, and a season that does not negotiate. The fleet was sinking, and the winds screamed through the wreckage of broken masts like a mournful anthem mourning the mightiest military force the 13th century had ever assembled as it vanished into an abyss it never mapped. Kublai Khan did not receive defeat as reality. He received it as a doubled challenge, announcing immediately a 3rd Japanese campaign even more massive than what preceded it, as though the typhoon had been mere misfortune to be answered with greater insistence. But Kublai now waged war on too many frontiers simultaneously. Vietnam defied him, Java had expelled him, the shattered armada demanded rebuilding from the keel upward, and his imperial treasury felt a weight it had never carried before. The Korean people rose against the forced labor of building another invasion fleet. The soldiers of China grew exhausted from seaborne campaigns that yielded no plunder worth the drowning, and the army's leadership began whispering its preference for solid ground. Then Kublai Khan died in 1294, and with him died the dream of Japan's conquest. His successors lacked the obsession to complete what he had begun, and the Japanese chapter was quietly closed in the empire's ledgers, never reopened. Japan alone, of all the great kingdoms that faced the Mongol tide, remained an island no Mongol boot ever conquered, shielded by its legendary samurai, its savage resistance, and the hurricanes that faith called destiny and strategy called blood-purchased time. The word kamikaze was inscribed into every Japanese military lexicon from that day forward, and the name returned 7 centuries later in World War II, worn by pilots who carried the wind's name as the last weapon of a dying empire. The strategic lesson this episode deposits in the mind of every serious military analyst is this: resistance is not merely a frontal contest decided by the sword. Sometimes it is the art of buying time until the enemy becomes the victim of his own nature. Modern war colleges studying the Mongol defeat at Japan have extracted from it a foundational lesson about the lethal relationship between timing, logistics, and the natural world. The greatest force can be undone by what no blade can ever kill. Post-victory Japan was not a nation confident solely in its own capacity. It was a nation that believed an invisible barrier of divine will and raging ocean and unyielding samurai stood between its shores and the ambitions of the world. That doctrine of divine protection, dangerous in its extremity as history would later demonstrate, served for centuries as the fuel of Japanese identity, reminding every generation that the island was defended by something deeper than iron and stone. On the Mongol side, the Japanese defeat marked the first unmistakable signal that the vast empire had begun discovering its own limits, that every wave, however high its summit reaches, eventually finds a shore that breaks it absolutely. In Japan, a theology of divine election took root and grew, that the island was shielded by a particular and watchful providence, that heaven defended those who first defended themselves, and that endurance was the condition of grace, not its substitute. The deepest truth this history reveals to the contemplative mind is that victory never arrives from one direction. It is always the sum of human will and natural variables and the enemy's errors and everything that moves between them. Kublai Khan, who had opened China and bent ancient empires to his doctrine, found in an island that barely registered on his silk maps a destiny stronger than his iron will, and those shores carried in their sand the eternal message: the land defended by those who truly belong to it cannot simply be taken by those who merely desire it. And the sea continues to tell incoming vessels the story of a day it witnessed 4,400 ships descend into its depths, and it laughs in the silence of one who understands that no force upon this earth equals the force of those who resist at precisely the right moment in time.